Hello, and welcome to Perspectives on Faith on Ebru TV. My name is Dr. Amir Hussain. I'm a professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Joining me today is Dr. Diana Steigerwald, who's a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at California State University at Long Beach. Dr. Steigerwald, welcome. Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
I was born in New York City. My father died when I was a baby. My father died of a car accident, and my mother was a French Canadian. So my mother decided to go back to Canada. So I was raised in Montreal, so I speak French. I did not have time to speak English. I was born in New York City, but I did not have time to speak English. I was already in Montreal speaking French.
So you grew up in this very cosmopolitan city in Montreal,
speaking
French?
Yes, speaking French and going to all the French schools.
And then tell me about your university career and your background there.
Yes. At the end of, I've done a BA in political science and economics. And at the end of my BA, I was tired of politics. And I started to read on Greek philosophy. Okay. And I'm very interested in Greek philosophy. And then I came on a book written by Abdelrahman Badawi about the transfer of Greek philosophy into Islam, and I was very interested in this book. And I was what I liked about it is that there was a kind of union between philosophy and religion in Islam. That in Islam it was they could live together as being one, as opposed to the Western philosophy where there's a kind of split between religion and philosophy. So philosophy, after the Middle Age, there's a split, and then the philosophy is a way, and religion another way.
Right. Whereas in the Islamic tradition,
and the Islamic tradition, it still exists up until today. They can be together.
And is that what inspired you to do a PhD in Islamic studies?
Exactly. So from that time, I started to read books about Islamic philosophy, and I started to read books about Henri Corbin. And Henri Corbin was a specialist of Shiism. Shiism is are a minority in Islam. About 20% of the Muslims are Shiites, and then the majority of Muslims are Sunni. But it's much more the Shiite who were attached to the Islamic philosophy.
To the philosophical traditions.
Exactly.
And so where did you do your PhD?
I did my PhD at McGill University, Montreal, and I did it in French because I had the right of doing it in French, because McGill is in Quebec, so in Quebec the language is French. So
you wrote your dissertation in French?
So I did my MA thesis in French and my PhD in French. And since I was interested in Henri Corbin, I read all the book of Henri Corbin. I proposed, there was like a Professor Herman Nandelt. I did my MA thesis with Professor Walker, who was a specialist of Ismailism. But after a while, Professor Walker left, and then there was Professor Herman Nandelt. And Professor Herman Nandelt was a disciple of Henri Corbin, and he has done he studied at the Sorbonne under Henri Corbin, so he knew very well Shiism and knew very well Sufism. So I decided to do my thesis with him, and there was no problem with doing it in French, because he was coming from Switzerland, so he was speaking German, French, and so there was no problem. So I decided, my first proposal was I wanted to work on Islamic science and Islam, and I wanted to work on Jabir ibn Ayyan, who was a disciple of the Shiite Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. But Herman Nandelt refused about this proposal. So
what did you end up writing?
So I ended up writing on Shahrastani, because there was I have read an articles about Shahrastani and written by Jalaluddin Naini.
And so you ended up writing on Shahrastani. Can you tell us a little bit about him? Because I think most of our viewers probably don't know a lot about who Shahrastani was.
Okay. He was born in Shahrastan. It's in the province of Khorasan. Presently, it's in Turkmenistan. So it's a country which is in the north of Iran. Okay, we don't know much about his family. We don't know much about his life, but we know that he had a traditional education. So he had a traditional education into Sunnism. So he was initiated to the Asharite Kalam, which is a school of Sunni thought, by the disciple of Juvaini, who was an Asharite theologian. And then he was also initiated to the Shafi school of Sunni Shafi school by a friend of Ghazali, who was very known to be a Sunni Asharite and a multifaceted thinker.
So what time periods are we talking about with Shahrastani?
The 12th century. He died in 1153, if you want to.
Okay. So here's this person who's very much raised in that traditional medieval Islamic world, learns all about theology from the dominant Asharite school, is part of the Shafi'i legal tradition within Islam. Can you talk a little bit about that world, a little bit about the world of the 12th century and who some of the important thinkers were? You mentioned Ghazali, maybe what some of the important ideas were at that point, to give us some sort of setting the stage, a background of what was the world into which Shahrastani was born.
Mm-hmm. It was the Abbasid Caliphate during the Abbasid, and it was really like the time where Islam reached its peak. So there was a kind of every field were reaching a kind of maturity, because before there was a lot of debates in the previous century, but during that time, then people, after all the debates, then they reached their maturity, and the Asharites, they tried to Al-Ashari tried to reconcile different schools of thought at that time. So it was.
So he was really born into a world that was in the full flower.
It was a flowering of
theology,
Islam. Yeah, exactly.
So who were some of his teachers? Who were some of the people that we know he studied with?
He had disciples of Juvaini and the friends of Ghazali.
Okay, so he was trained by disciples of Ghazali, who was probably the most famous medieval Islamic theologian.
Yes.
Very, very well-known Muslim scholars that he studied with and worked with. Can you talk about some of the works that he wrote, and perhaps is there one work that's more famous than any other?
He had this, he was educated in Nishapur, and he had the traditional education, but he traveled. Afterwards, he traveled and he went to Mecca. And on his way back, he came back to Baghdad. And then since he knew a friend, then he managed to be, he was hired by the school, the Nizamiya school of Baghdad, which was a very famous school of Asharites and Shafi school. Ghazali taught there, so he taught there for 3 years. Okay, and afterwards he wrote his book on religions and sect,
which is so important in dialogue, to be able to at least give the point of view of the people that you disagree with, but honestly, and with respect to say, here's the point of view of this group, and here's perhaps why I disagree with that. So is that the book that you analyzed for your dissertation?
I did analyze many books for my dissertation, so I look about 5 books of Shahrastani at the same time, because my objective was to prove was he Ismaili or Sunni, and then I had to look at all his work to find out. Because if we look only at the Milai, we will not find out about it.
And yet he's able to write this wonderful manuscript. Can you talk a little bit about either that book, the Kitab al-Milal wal-Nihal, or any of his other writings?
Well, since his book was not too well received because he was too objective, then he started to write a book on Islamic theology called the Kitab al-Nihayat. And in this book, he tries to defend more explicitly the Asharite points of view. So, because I think he wanted to regain his job at the Nizamiya, so he tries to write something more, defending more the Asherites' point of view. But even though he was doing that, he was even continuing presenting the arguments of other schools without necessarily, he would not necessarily always refute all the arguments.
And what was it about Shahrastani that particularly drew you to him? You know, why were you interested in his writing, for example, and not some of the other writers of the 12th century?
I mean, I was interested in many other writers, but I knew that Professor Herman Randolph would accept this proposal, so, so I guess I took, I did this topic because Herman Randolph was interested in the topic, and at that time there were professors in the Sorbonne working on Shahrastani. So there were professors who were translating the Kitab al-Milal into French, the complete translation.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that he was able to do in terms of maybe reconciling? You started off talking about how one of the appeals for you of studying Shahrastani was that he was one of those people that was reconciling theology and philosophy, or at least didn't see that split as we have in the sort of the Christian West between theology and philosophy as very separate kind of disciplines. Can you talk a little bit about how Shahrastani was able to do that, you know, integrate philosophy into theology? Was he aware of Greek philosophical traditions? Did he bring those into his work?
In fact, he was blending three traditions into his philosophy. So he was taking elements from the Sunni Asharite, some belief of the Sunni Asharite, and he was taking elements from the Ismaili Shiite, Ismaili, and he was also taking elements from Islamic philosophy of Ibn Sina. I mean, he's doing, there's a kind of blending of all these three school of thought in him, like a synthesis of the three. So he found a common ground between the three schools that would be exclusive, that people would not necessarily accept that they are together, but he could find a middle ground or concept that agree, you know. So
could you tell us a little bit about each of those schools? Like, for example, the Asharite school was the dominant theological school in the Middle Ages. Can you tell us a little bit about who Al-Ashari was, what that school was about?
Al-Ashari first was a Mutazilite, so there was a kind of debate between the Asharite and the Mutazilite. Mutazilite would tend to say that there's a free will, and then the Asharite school would focus more on the predestination of things. So there was a kind of debate, and Al-Ashari was a Mutazilite, and he left the Mutazilite to tend towards more the predestination.
And so that's how Asherism became the sort of dominant theological
it became
school.
became the dominant school of theology at that time, and afterwards also.
Great. But then you also had philosophical traditions happening there, and you talked about getting interested in this through the translation movements of Greek philosophy into Arabic and its influence on Islamic thought. Can you talk a little bit about that? You know, what was the role of the Arab or the Islamic world in not just preserving but maintaining, you know, the Greek philosophical traditions?
Because there was a lot of work translated from Greek into Arabic, and then it's because of that they were retranslated into Latin later, so that the Western world could get the knowledge of the Greek.
Yeah, one of the things that always frustrates me is when we talk about separate civilizations, you know, as if our Western civilization wasn't deeply influenced by Islamic contributions to that. And so you have, for example, here, you know, the great Greek philosophers were preserved by Arab, sometimes Muslim thinkers, and then transmitted back to the Western context.
Yeah, well, there's a debate. You know, some people say that Plato and Aristotle are Eastern.
So in terms of their thought, or just in terms of?
They come from the Greek. Some Muslims consider the Greek world as being East.
And I suppose it's all relative. East and West are relative terms. East compared to what? West compared to what? What do you take as your central point? Are there things from that medieval period that we can learn from in the modern world?
Well, I think if we just go back just to Shahrastani, we can learn that it's important to be open-minded and then learn about all the different groups that exist within Islam until we master the basic belief of each group, and then we understand the reasoning beyond each group, just for the sake of being very open-minded. And just because I believe that nobody has the truth, but the truth is usually when there are debates, then we can get in the middle. If we get in the middle, then we are closer to the truth, or it's the only way people can evolve this way, or
And you see that with the great medieval theologians. We've talked about Al-Ghazali, probably the most famous medieval Islamic theologian. And here's someone who has issues, for example, with the philosophical tradition within Islam. And in order to refute what he sees as problems, writes an entire book, talking about the philosophical tradition. So I think that speaks to me, to what you're talking about. Here is someone who really wants to learn about what the other person's point of view is, and then is able to refute that. But I think that in our modern world, we don't do that. We don't listen to the other person. We don't take their point of view seriously. And here, in the Middle Ages, you have people that not only took that point of view seriously, but learned it. Ghazali studied all about Islamic philosophy in order to get some sense of how it was that people who were making those arguments were making those arguments, and then was able to refute them. In his own
I think this week, today Muslims should not even use the word heretics, because only God can judge who is an heretic.
Right.
Or there will be the day of the judgment, and God will decide who is an heretic, who is not an heretic. But people should not do that. On the contrary, they should be open-minded and learn about all the points of view, and then it's through the debate or through talking with other people who have different points of view that we can learn and go learn where is the truth, or be closer to the truth. Absolutely. Nobody has the truth. I think nobody has the truth.
Except for God.
Except for God, or a very high people like prophets, for example. But
in terms of Shahrastani's own work, did he do those kinds of things? Was he able to sort of, with some sensitivity, represent the views of his opponents? Because clearly he's got a point of view that he wants to get across, and he's writing that in his works. But is he someone that takes seriously, his opponents' points of view when he's doing that debate and that discussion?
I think so, because he shows the good arguments of all the school, So it brings people to even the opponents to think about their own beliefs, to put back into question their own beliefs. So it really puts question people, make them question.
Thank you for that. We will come back to this wonderful discussion with Dr. Diana Steigerwald on perspectives on faith on Ebru TV, but at this point we'll stop for a minute. Hello, and welcome back to Perspectives on Faith on Ebru TV. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Hussain. Our guest today is Dr. Diana Steigerwald, who is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Steigerwald, when did you come to Cal State Long Beach?
I arrived in the fall 2001, and
so that must have been a very traumatic time.
Yeah, it was very traumatic for me. And
that day of 9/11, I was just concerned about my friends in New York, if they were alive. So you were here just a few weeks before 9/11 happened?
Yes, I just came in August 2001, and then.
And so you start teaching courses on Islam after 9/11.
I had experience teaching Islam before the 9/11.
Sure. But what was it like? And maybe can you talk a little bit about some of the differences? Because you taught courses before 9/11 at different universities. Did you see a difference in teaching about Islam before 9/11 and after 9/11, particularly in an American context?
Yes, I saw a big difference. And I even had one case of a student who the first day of class came and said that all Muslims are potential terrorists because they don't separate religion and politics.
And politics,
you know?
yeah.
And then from the start, my course there was fire in my class, and unfortunately, the many Muslims felt threatened, and then they left the class. Okay. And then I had to explain that this is not Islam.
Right.
And as the course was going on, I talk about angels and everything that exists and everything that is very positive about Islam. And then the person who was creating problems at the beginning left the class because I think he was looking for something evil about Islam. And then I was presenting something positive about Islam. So, and from that time, he left.
It was very
so
different.
I think since the 9/11 event, we need to explain always that Islam is not is a faith of peace. It's not a faith about politics. You know?
Yeah,
so
I came to California in 1997, and so I taught courses for 4 years before 9/11. And in my case, I think before 9/11, my students really didn't know a lot about Islam. Whether they were Muslim students or not, they really didn't have a chance to study about their own tradition if they were Muslim until they came to the university. So my university course was often the first time for students who were Muslim to learn about Islam. Post 9/11, the students came in with all sorts of misinformation. You know what I'm saying? That before 9/11, they came in ignorant. After 9/11, they came in with all sorts of prejudices because where they learned about it was from the popular media, from talk radio, from newscasters who knew nothing about Islam but were convinced that the Quran was a book of violence and that all Muslims, in your students' term, were potential terrorists. Did you find the same thing, that people came in with very negative images of Islam after 9/11?
Exactly. And what I found that I had to do in class was to explain that the U.S. policy is not always very good.
In your classes at California State University, Long Beach, do you have a lot of Muslim students in the class, and is that experience? Because for me, it really was interesting to see when I was teaching at Cal State Northridge, a lot of Muslim students would take my course on Islam because it was their first chance to learn about Islam. Did you find that at Cal State Long Beach?
I do have a lot of Muslims coming from different regions, and there's a bit of difference of opinion depending on where they come from. So yes.
And I'm sure, like me, you use those as teaching moments. You know, it's different for me now. Now I teach at Loyola Marymount University, which is a Catholic Jesuit university, and so there may be 1 or 2 Muslims in my class. When I was teaching at Cal State Northridge in a class on Islam, there would have been 5 or 6 Muslims, some of whom were Sunni, some of whom were Shia, because as you know, yes. Southern California, particularly Los Angeles, has a huge Shia population. And it was great because in that classroom, you would have Sunni students, and you'd have Imami Shia students, and you'd have Ismaili students. And it was wonderful for them to be able to work out those different ways of being Muslim. So do you see that in your classroom as well, of people coming from different backgrounds or even different ethnic backgrounds?
Yeah, I saw much more difference in ethnic background. If we were coming from India or coming from different I mean, the problem that I had in teaching Islam to sometimes Muslim is sometimes they come from very strict Orthodox religious, I mean, they have already their religious views and they are not ready to listen to other views. And myself, I do present all the views.
Sure.
Like Sharastani would have presented all the views, then I do present the Shiite point of view. And at the end of my course, I want them to learn that they understand both points of view without taking one side over the others. So I challenge them a lot, So I thought sometimes there is a kind of resistance.
And do you find that that's a learning experience for the non-Muslim students to get a sense of some of the diversity? Because we know that in other traditions.
Yes.
We are both teaching in Southern California, which is, Los Angeles now is the largest Catholic archdiocese in the U.S., and yet huge diversity within the Catholic tradition. So we know about that. We know about Latino Catholics as distinct from Irish Catholics, as distinct from German Catholics, but we tend to think that all Muslims are the same and forget about the ethnic kinds of differences. And so is it kind of a learning experience for your non-Muslim students to see that diversity in the Muslim world?
Oh, I think the non-Muslim learn a lot in my class. And I think often they are surprised to see that Islam is so close to Christianity. I mean, to see that there is almost the same belief, that many beliefs are the same, you know. So I think they are always very surprised. Oh, yes, Muslim believe in Mary, Muslim, you know, they are so surprised.
Or that Allah is not a different God, that it's the same God.
It's the same God, it's the same. They are so surprised, and to see that Islam is very positive, there are very beautiful things in Islam. I think the non-Muslim are learning a lot, and the Muslim are learning a lot because I do challenge them to force them to learn about different school of thought, that they would not learn this otherwise.
Sure. And that's the difference between the scholarly study of the tradition. I mean, I tell my Muslim students exactly the same thing that I'm sure you tell your Muslim students, is that just because you're a Muslim, don't expect you'll come into this course and get an A. It's like just because you're a native speaker of English doesn't mean you'll go into an English course and get an A automatically.
Yeah, to my great surprise, sometimes non-Muslim do better than Muslims because they work harder, I guess. When in their research paper, they would really do a good research paper, as the Muslim think, oh, we already know, so we don't. And they sometimes the Muslim thinks, we already know, so it's going to be an easy A. This class is going to be an easy A, and at the end they realize, oh, it was not an easy A. There's a lot. And I'm challenging them because I'm forcing them to learn not only about the Sunni, but all the different schools. So,
are there other issues that come up for you in terms of teaching Islam, particularly teaching Islam in America, you know, as a Canadian, or teaching Islam post 9/11?
Well, I do not have any. I don't see other issues, but the problems is sometimes when you change school. I taught in New Brunswick, then I had mainly only Christian, teaching only Christian, so you don't have the same challenge as when I went to Calgary. I had another challenge that I had less challenge here in California, but in Calgary there was a lot of challenge. And being a Western teaching Islam, sometimes the people look at me in the wrong way, as if I'm going to say something bad about Islam. And what I was so surprised is I was saying positive things about Islam, and the Muslim were like, thinking that I was attacking Islam, but I was not attacking Islam. I was just
and I'm sure they
saying positive things. But how are they afraid about? I don't know.
No, and I'm sure because post 9/11 you had so many negative images of Islam and Muslims in the media and the public discourse. I'm sure for many of the Muslim students, they're coming in and think, okay, is this person going to say exactly the same thing we've been hearing on television about Islam being this religion of terrorism, or the Quran being a book of violence? And here you are doing something very different. In fact, trying to affirm the idea that for the majority of Muslims, Islam very much is about peace and coexistence, not about violence, that Muslims don't read the Quran as this book of violence to go out there and kill people from other religious traditions. But it's very different for the Muslim students to get that. I'm sure at the end of the class, they've probably come to you and thanked you, or wanted to take other classes with you, because they get a sense of who you are.
Yes. I think the Muslim usually at the end, when Islam is attacked, I was very good to defend Islam, so they was very surprised that she's able to defend Islam or defend the cause of Islam, and they were very happy for that. You know, at the end, the Muslims were happy that I was defending.
And I'm sure you see a lot of the non-Muslim students have their views challenged, because, like I said, they don't come in neutral. You know, before 9/11, they may have come in neutral, not knowing anything about Islam. Post 9/11, they come in thinking that Islam is a religion of violence, that Islam is a religion of terrorism, that Muslims are violent people. And so it becomes important to have to almost to say that Muslims are in the full possession of humanity, that yes, Muslims have done some horrible things, but Muslims have done some beautiful, wonderful things as well.
Yeah. Or the essence of Islam is beautiful. I mean, and I mean, people doing terrorism, these are probably not Islam. Most of the time it's not Islamic, unfortunately. it's portrayed as being Islamic, but it's not. The essence of Islam is peaceful.
Yeah. And we were talking earlier about Shahrastani in the medieval period within Islam. Are there things that you think that we in the modern world, particularly those of us who are Muslim, can learn from our own heritage, particularly that medieval heritage? Are there things from the Middle Ages that we can incorporate into our world?
Yeah, I think from the Middle Age we need to go back to the Middle Age in a way. In the way that we need to, different school of thought in Islam should come together and talk about it. And just for the sake of understand different points of view and being open-minded. Because I think the Middle Age was very rich because there was a lot of controversies, but people were learning from each other. And then afterward there was less debate, and then everybody stopped debating, and then the Islam went down. Islam came down to.
And I think that's one of the wonderful things that North American Muslims can offer to the worldwide Muslim community, because here in North America, we have all those differences. We have Sunni Muslims. We have within the Sunni tradition all the different ethnic groups, Turkish Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, Arab Muslims. We've got Shia Muslims from the Twelver Shia tradition. We've got Ismaili Muslims from the Ismaili tradition. And here in North America, we get along, and particularly with regard, I'm thinking now of Sunni Shia conflicts. Here in Los Angeles, we have a very large Shia population, and yet Sunnis and Shias have publicly talked about working together here in a way that's very different from what's happening. The tragic case, of course, is Iraq. Because of the war, you've got all the violence going on. So I think in many ways, North American Muslims, precisely because we have that diversity here, are in a position to talk about how we can pass that on to the rest of the Muslim world and do that. And I think in the Middle Ages, you saw exactly the same
I think the message of Islam is that unity and multiplicity. This is the main message of Islam. God created people different, but what people who are different should learn how to live together in a unity. So bring your difference. Go towards what you have in common. Forget about the difference. Maybe we can go and put everything work together. What makes a beautiful garden is the fact that there are different kinds of flowers in this garden. And if it was only the same kind, everybody was the same, and it would be a boring garden. But the beauty of the garden is that there are different flowers of different kinds. And I think God created people different, with different views, and then we should come together and respect human beings as it is, the sanctity of the human being. I think this is the main message of Islam. So learning to respect other people and live together. And all people who say they are Muslim, they are Muslim. We should not judge anybody, and these people are heretics, or these people. We should not judge anybody. If they say they are Muslim, then they are Muslim.
And it's God who will judge us all. And in the final
exactly. Don't take the place of God.
Absolutely.
Don't try to judge people. God will do it, but just try to live in harmony with other people. And I think to live in peace and harmony, this is the main message of Islam.
And the other thing I think that we can offer here in the North American context is that as North American Muslims, we're in a minority position. In parts of the world, Muslims are in the majority. I was born in Pakistan. 96% of the people in Pakistan are Muslims. That's a very different situation than here, where maybe 2%, 3% of North Americans are Muslims. So, in Canada, for example, Islam is the second largest religion. In the US, I've seen population estimates as low as 2.5 million. I've seen estimates as high as 10 million. My own sense is 6 to 7 million Muslims in the US, which is a fairly large number, but it's a very small number compared to the 300 million people in America. And so I think one of the things that being in a minority does is it forces you to understand other traditions. You can't dominate when you're in the minority. You can dominate when you're the majority.
Yeah, this is the problem often, that people who are in the majority usually don't necessarily make any effort to try to understand the other points of view, because they say we are part of the majority, so you are insignificant, compared to And I think this is wrong. I mean, it's not because the Sunni are the majority that they should impose their view on everybody. On the contrary, they should not impose their view, and they should let the others, because we see that often that in some countries, the Shiite, they don't even say that they are Shiite because they are afraid of persecution. And I think this is unfortunate, and there should not be any persecution nowhere, and people should be free to believe whatever they want to believe.
And here in North America, you also have that wonderful interreligious cooperation that exists between not just the monotheistic traditions, of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but other traditions as well. And so at my university, we have, for example, some really interesting Catholic-Buddhist dialogue, some really interesting Hindu-Christian dialogue. And I think that's really important because in many ways, where we are living in Los Angeles is a microcosm of the world, where you've got Muslim communities, but Jewish communities, Hindu communities, Sikh communities, all sorts of ethnic communities, and are able to get along in relative peace and harmony. And I think that's really the crucial thing about our modern period. But we see that in the Middle Ages as well. The cosmopolitanness. You look at someone like the great Jalaluddin Rumi, born in what is now, I suppose, Afghanistan, dies in what is now Turkey. Wonderful, wonderful connections here. Writing things in Persian, writing things in Arabic, and that hallmark that we think of the modern world as being cosmopolitan is really there in the Middle Ages. I mean, the scholars that you've studied, they traveled.
Oh,
right?
They traveled
over
a
the
lot,
Muslim
and there
world.
was a lot of traveling, and there was a lot of people going. Trade, a lot of trade, so there was a lot of travel.
And
it
it
was
would have
still
taken,
a
it would have taken time.
cosmologic world.
Right. And I think in some ways more so because that travel would have involved time. Now if I'm going to make the Hajj to Mecca, let's say, I call up my travel agent, I get on a plane, I go fly into Jeddah. You talked about Shahrastani going to Mecca.
Yeah.
That's, how long would that have taken?
Yeah, 1 year.
Yeah.
It was very long.
And in that journey, you're interacting with people, you're meeting people, you're stopping by the road, you're eating, with people. And so in some ways, can we learn that, from the ancient or the medieval world? Not just the cosmopolitanness, but the relationships. Maybe that's what I'm getting at, that I think these days we don't think enough about the important relationships that we have with people, and it really comes down to that. If you're traveling with someone, it's one thing if you're traveling beside them on an airplane for 12 hours. It's another thing entirely if you're on a caravan with them that takes 6 months or 5 months or 4 months. And just the exchange of ideas, the time to read, the time to think.
I think in the Middle Age, people were meeting more than today. People are meeting through the internet, so and there are controversy on the internet, even.
And you get into disputes with people you've never met in real time.
Yeah, exactly.
You've just interacted with them on the keyboard. And then when you meet them, you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's not what they meant at all. It's those kinds of things that I think are so important there. Excuse me. Are there other things that you think we, in the modern period, can learn from earlier periods of Islam, either specifically from someone like Shahrastani or other thinkers
I think
in that time
the
period?
most important, why Islam was so high during the medieval time was because Muslims were eager to learn, and there's a hadith of the Prophet, even go to China if you want to get knowledge, even go to
Seek
China
knowledge, so
to
you
get
find it in China.
Yeah. So, the Muslims were eager to learn about everything, and they took the best. They were very open-minded, and that's why Islam was very at its peak. And then we need to go back to this, being very open-minded and take the knowledge and take the best of every people and every group and whatever. We get the knowledge, and this you can find the knowledge. Everybody, every ethnic group has knowledge, and we can learn from. If the Prophet said to learn about China, to go to China, the majority of Chinese were Taoists, so we need to learn about Taoism and how can we find a link between Islam and Taoism and whatever religion we want to study. We should be open-minded and want to learn.
Yeah, and those connections are so important because, again, you saw that in the Middle Ages, you know, within Central Asia, connections not just with Muslims and Christians and Jews, but, you know, with Buddhists, with Taoists, you know, all those kinds of things. So important, which I think we've lost in that contemporary world. And when I look at, you know, what's going on with the war in Iraq, you know, my heart breaks because of what Baghdad was. I mean, this used to be the center of learning, really, in the Western world, because you've talked about, you know, Ghazali teaching at the Nizamiya Shahrastani, taught there, that the reason that this was such a wonderful place was precisely because you brought scholars from all over the world, and not just Muslim scholars. It wasn't limited to say the only people that have anything of interest to say on this topic are Muslims. You know, you had Christians, you had Jews, you had other people working there. And I think you see that the danger when you don't have that anymore, when you say it's just my group that has the truth. It's just my group that can work on this question.
And I think this is the cause why there was a decline in Islam, because when people start to say we have the truth and we don't want to debate anymore, then it's in a way dangerous, I find. Because I think nobody has the truth. So if we need to country to open up to find the truth.
Yeah, and that really is the dangerous thing of, you know, what do you do with a person who claims that they've found it and done that? That's the real hard part. You know, as scholars, you and I are involved in that search for truth. That's what we do as academics. I think the real danger is the person that says, I've got the truth and this is it, and anyone else that doesn't believe in this truth is now you know, liable to be killed. You know, real dangers there.
Just think about the one Quranic verses saying that, I mean, people who have faith are really pious. It could be, I mean, a woman could be more advanced spiritually than a man. A black woman could be more advanced than a white male. It's not a question of race, or sex, or anything. It's a question of having faith, and the knowledge is something which is inner, and that only God knows who is more advanced than others, you know.
And that's one of the things I always try to tell my Muslim students is the Quran always emphasizes this word taqwa, you know, piety, that the best person is the one that has the most taqwa. It's not the white person, the black person, the, you know, the Arab person, the Turkish person, the Pakistani person. It's the person that has the most taqwa, the most piety, and the most awareness of God. And that, you know, for me as a Muslim, for me as a Muslim, that's really what's important, that it's not about what country you come from. It's not about the color of your skin. It's not about whether you're a man or a woman. It's, do you have that awareness? Do you have that piety? And anyone who has that
a kind of, I think it means also a respect for God, a kind of a state of being, you don't want to displease God. So a person who has taqwa is really like a believer who don't want to display in anything the person does. He doesn't want to displease God, and he's always conscious of God. So I think, and I mean, we cannot judge because only God knows who has taqwa, who don't have.
And I think going back to what we were starting with, I think that's really the problem in the contemporary Muslim world, that people have gotten away from worrying about displeasing God to worrying about pleasing their fellow human being and trying to say the things that, you know, some human in a position of power wants to hear, rather than, you know, do we do this? Islam, as we all know, literally means submission, and submission to God. You know, do we submit our will to God, or do we submit our will to other human people? I think that's the real danger for us in the modern Islamic world.
Yeah, I mean, to be a real Muslim is to be an example for humanity, because Muslims believe that Islam is the best religion. So if Islam is the best religion, then they should behave as the example for humanity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Diana Steigerwald, for our conversation here on Perspectives on Faith. My name is Amir Hussain, and I've been honored to host this episode of Perspectives on Faith for Ebru TV. Please join us again next time.